Picture a dim, windowless room deep in the stone corridors of medieval Europe, where the only light comes from a single flickering torch. The air is thick with the smell of damp stone and fear. In the center, a lone figure sits bound to a wooden chair, while across from them, shadowy inquisitors prepare their questions, not just any questions, but ones designed to uncover heresy, doubt, or disobedience. This was the reality for thousands during the era of the Inquisition, a period whose name alone still sends a chill down the spine centuries later. But what really happened behind those closed doors? How did an institution meant to protect faith become synonymous with terror and secrecy? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most feared and misunderstood organizations. We often hear about the Inquisition in hushed tones or sensational stories, but the full truth is far more complex and haunting than many realize. This wasn't just about religion, it was about power, control, and the human desire to enforce conformity, often with brutal efficiency. From whispered accusations in crowded town squares to private trials where confession was the only escape from unimaginable pain, the Inquisition wove a web of fear across continents and generations. And while we might think we know this story, the deepest secrets have remained buried until now. Join me as we step into the shadows and uncover the dark secrets of the Inquisition. We'll explore how it began, who was targeted, and why its methods were so effective and so terrifying. This is a journey into the heart of one of history's great mysteries, where faith and fear collided, and where the echoes of those dark chambers can still be felt today. You'll come away with a new understanding of how authority can be twisted, and why some stories demand to be remembered. So settle in and let's uncover the truth together. To understand the sheer scale of its impact, we must first journey back to its beginnings, long before the infamous Spanish Inquisition captured the public imagination. The story starts in the 12th century, a time of immense social and religious upheaval across Europe. The Church, the most powerful institution of the Middle Ages, faced a growing threat not from external armies but from internal dissent. New religious movements were gaining popularity, challenging the Church's authority and its interpretations of Scripture. The most prominent of these was Catholicism, which took root powerfully in the Languedoc region of what is now southern France. The Cathars, also known as Albigensians, held beliefs the Church deemed dangerously heretical. They saw the material world as the creation of an evil force, rejected the Old Testament, and dismissed the Church's sacraments as meaningless. To the established religious order, this wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a direct attack on the very foundation of spiritual and social life. Earlier efforts to counter such movements through preaching and debate, like those led by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, had largely failed. The heresy was spreading, and to the alarm of church authorities, it was finding sympathy among local nobles and common people alike. A more forceful, organized response was deemed not just necessary but urgent. This pressing need for a systematic solution led to one of the most pivotal moments in the Inquisition's formation. In the year 1231, Pope Gregory IX issued a series of papal bulls that fundamentally changed how the Church dealt with heresy. He didn't just authorize a new campaign, he created a new institution. Gregory IX appointed special papal legates, empowered to investigate and try suspected heretics directly under his authority. These were the first inquisitors. This was a revolutionary step because it centralized the process, taking it out of the often unreliable hands of local bishops and placing it under the direct control of the Pope himself. These men were given sweeping powers to travel, investigate, and pass judgment. The methods they developed were what made this new system so formidable and ultimately so feared. Inquisitors would arrive in a town and first deliver a sermon, calling for repentance and encouraging people to come forward and confess their own errors, and crucially to accuse their neighbors. Those who confessed willingly during this initial period of grace often faced lighter penances, but after that window closed, the real machinery of investigation would begin. The process relied heavily on secret denunciations and the testimony of witnesses, which the accused had no right to face. This created an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion, where a whispered rumor could be enough to bring someone before the tribunal. It was this formal, papal-backed system, born from the struggle against Catharism, that established the blueprint for the Inquisition. It evolved from a reaction to a specific crisis into a permanent, powerful tool for enforcing doctrinal purity, setting a precedent for centuries of religious persecution to follow. Though the Papal Inquisition found its footing in France and Italy, its true power emerged as it spread, adapting to new lands and new threats with chilling efficiency. No longer confined to rooting out Catharism, this system of control began to travel, its methods refined and its mandate expanded by the complex political and religious forces shaping medieval Europe. Its journey south and west into the Iberian Peninsula, however, would transform it into something even more formidable, an institution deeply intertwined with the very identity of emerging nations. The most famous and impactful of these expansions was, of course, into Spain, but to understand why it took root there so fiercely, we must look to a centuries-long struggle known as the Reconquista. For hundreds of years, Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain had been fighting to reclaim territory from Muslim rulers who had governed much of the peninsula since the 8th century. This wasn't just a war of borders, it was framed as a holy war, a crusade to reclaim the land for Christendom. By the late 15th century, this effort was nearing its climax under the joint rule of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Their marriage had united two powerful kingdoms, and their primary goal was the complete political and religious unification of Spain. With the fall of the last Muslim stronghold, Granada, in 1492, that territorial goal was achieved. But for the Catholic monarchs, as they were known, a new problem emerged. Their vast new kingdom was not religiously unified. It contained large populations of Muslims and also a significant number of Jews, many of whom had converted to Christianity and were known as conversos. Suspicion festered among some old Christians that these conversos were secretly practicing their former faiths in private, a crime known as Judaizing. To the crown, this perceived heresy was a direct threat to the stability and soul of their new nation. They believed a single, unified faith was the essential glue that would hold their hard-won kingdom together. This desire for internal purity and control led Isabella and Ferdinand to seek a unique tool, their own Inquisition. In 1478, they received a bull from Pope Sixtus IV authorizing the creation of a royal inquisition answerable directly to the Spanish crown, not to the Pope in Rome. This was a crucial distinction. While the medieval Inquisition was a tool of the Church, the Spanish Inquisition became a tool of the state. Its Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, was a confessor to the Queen himself, symbolizing this intimate link between throne and tribunal. The primary targets were these conversos, but the Inquisition's reach would soon extend to other groups, including Muslims who had converted under pressure, known as Moriscos, and later, anyone accused of Protestantism, blasphemy, or even bigamy. The Spanish model proved so effective as an instrument of state control that it was soon exported. Portugal established its own royal inquisition in 1536, largely targeting Jewish converts who had fled from Spain. The Portuguese Inquisition became infamous for its own brutality and its reach extending across its burgeoning overseas empire, from Brazil to Goa in India, using its power to enforce religious conformity among colonists and indigenous populations alike. This ability to adapt and expand shows the Inquisition was not a static monster but an evolving system, its methods sharpened by the specific fears and ambitions of each region it infected. It was no longer just about fighting heresy, it was about building empires on a foundation of fear. Yet who were the men tasked with carrying out this grim mission? The inquisitors themselves were far from simple fanatics or brutish thugs. They were often among the most educated and intellectually sophisticated figures of their time. Recruitment typically drew from the Dominican and Franciscan orders, chosen for their theological training and their reputation for unwavering orthodoxy. These were men schooled in logic and debate, capable of dissecting complex arguments. Their training was rigorous, involving deep study of scripture, canon law, and the growing body of inquisitorial manuals that served as their guidebooks. They were taught to be suspicious, to look for inconsistencies in a person's story, and to interpret even the most mundane actions as potential evidence of hidden heresy. A person avoiding pork might be a secret Jew, while someone working on a saint's day could be rejecting church authority. To standardize this process across different regions, inquisitors relied on detailed manuals. The most famous of these was the Directorium Inquisitorum, written by Nicholas Eymerich in the 13th century and later expanded by Francisco Peña. This text was less a holy book and more a chillingly practical field guide. It provided precise instructions on every step of the process: how to conduct an interrogation, what questions to ask, how to evaluate testimony, and the exact procedures for sentencing. It even advised on the psychology of the accused, teaching inquisitors how to use hope and despair to elicit a confession. This manual ensured that whether an inquisitor was in a remote Spanish village or a busy Italian city, he operated from the same playbook, creating a terrifying consistency to the machinery of fear. Their power was virtually absolute within their jurisdiction. An inquisitor could compel anyone to appear before him, and refusal was itself considered evidence of guilt. He could seize property, imprison suspects indefinitely, and use the threat of excommunication, a spiritual death sentence in a deeply religious society, to force cooperation. This authority was amplified by a vast, shadowy network of informants known as familiars. These were lay people, often local volunteers, who acted as the eyes and ears of the Inquisition within their own communities. They reported on neighbors' conversations, their dining habits, even their attendance at church. This system turned every community into a potential panopticon, where anyone could be a spy, and a careless word over dinner could lead to a summons to the tribunal. No figure embodies the archetype of the powerful inquisitor more than Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain. A Dominican friar and a confessor to Queen Isabella, Torquemada was the living link between the throne and the tribunal. His name became synonymous with the Inquisition's most severe phase. He was a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness and the moral necessity of his brutal work. Under his leadership, the procedures became even more streamlined and ruthless. He centralized authority, established regional tribunals, and presided over the auto de fe, the public spectacles of penance and punishment designed to terrorize the population into compliance. While the exact number of executions during his tenure is hotly debated by historians, his legacy is one of relentless fervor, demonstrating how a single figure, armed with unwavering conviction and absolute power, could escalate a system of control into an instrument of profound terror. But the terrifying power of the Grand Inquisitor and his network would have been useless without the accusations that fueled it, a process that turned neighbor against neighbor and weaponized everyday gossip. The journey to the dungeon almost never began with a formal investigation. It started with a secret, whispered accusation. The Inquisition actively encouraged people to come forward and denounce others, offering a period of grace where one could confess their own sins and accuse others to lighten their own penance. This created an immediate incentive to talk, but the real engine of fear was the promise of anonymity. An individual could denounce someone without ever having to face them or reveal their identity, a system that empowered the malicious and the frightened alike. This veil of secrecy meant that an accusation could stem from virtually any motive, not just religious zeal. A long-standing feud over land, a business rivalry, a jilted lover, or even a simple personal slight could be settled by secretly naming someone to the Inquisition. The tribunals rarely questioned the motive behind a denunciation. They were required by their own rules to investigate every claim, no matter how baseless it might seem. This lack of filtering meant that the machinery of investigation was constantly in motion, powered by the petty grievances and hidden envies of an entire community. The fear was not just of the inquisitor himself, but of the person living next door. The standard for evidence was shockingly low. Unlike modern legal systems that require physical proof or multiple corroborating witnesses, the Inquisition often considered rumor and hearsay as valid grounds to open a case. The testimony of a single anonymous accuser, or even the general public fame that someone was a heretic, was enough to bring a person in for questioning. This placed the burden of proof almost entirely on the accused, who had to prove their innocence against charges that were often vague, secret, and impossible to specifically refute. You couldn't defend yourself against an accusation you weren't even allowed to hear in full. This atmosphere of pervasive suspicion fundamentally poisoned the social fabric of towns and villages. Trust eroded as people became afraid to speak freely even within their own homes, worried that a child, a servant, or a spouse might inadvertently repeat something that could be twisted into evidence of heresy. Something as simple as not eating pork on a certain day, working on a Sunday, or using a phrase that sounded unfamiliar could be misconstrued and reported. Life became a performance of perfect orthodoxy, where any deviation from the norm, no matter how innocent, could be your undoing. The community itself became the Inquisition's most effective tool, policing its own members through a constant, unspoken fear. Once a person was named and brought before the tribunal, they entered a world meticulously engineered to break their will and secure a confession. The process was not a search for objective truth in the way we might understand it today. It was a system designed to produce admissions of guilt, confirming the suspicions that had brought the accused there in the first place. The interrogation was the heart of this machinery, a calculated psychological assault that began long before any physical tool was ever displayed. The first and most potent weapon was isolation. Upon being taken into custody, a suspect was immediately placed in the inquisitorial prison. These were not mere holding cells. They were often small, dark, and damp dungeons designed to induce profound disorientation and despair. Prisoners were cut off from all contact with the outside world, no news from their family, no comfort from friends, and no understanding of how much time was passing. This complete sensory and social deprivation was a form of psychological torture in itself, making the inmate utterly dependent on their captors for any human interaction or information, thus increasing their vulnerability. Days would blur into weeks and sometimes months spent in this lonely, uncertain void, with the fear of what was to come festering in the silence. When the interrogation finally began, it was a masterclass in mental pressure. The accused was brought into a sparse room to face the inquisitor and his scribe. The questions were not shouted but asked with a calm, relentless persistence, often repeated for hours on end. The goal was to find inconsistencies in the prisoner's story, no matter how minor. An inquisitor trained in logic and theology would patiently circle, rephrase, and return to the same points, aiming to confuse and exhaust the person standing before him. Sleep deprivation was a common tactic, with interrogations dragging through the night to break down the prisoner's mental defenses through sheer fatigue. A weary mind, they knew, is far more likely to concede, agree, and confess just to end the ordeal. And always looming over every whispered question and every moment of strained silence was the threat of torture. It was crucial that this was a threat first. The official doctrine of the Church, through a papal bull known as ad extirpanda, permitted the use of torture but with specific, chillingly bureaucratic restrictions. It could not cause permanent injury or draw blood, and a confession given under torture was not considered valid unless the prisoner willingly reaffirmed it at least a full day later. This created a horrifying paradox where the physical pain was only the first step. The real psychological terror came from knowing you would have to, of your own free will, repeat the confession that had been torn from you, thus making it seem legitimate in the eyes of the court and God. The methods themselves were brutal exercises in engineered suffering. The most common was the strappado, where the prisoner's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists, dislocating their shoulders with a sudden, agonizing drop. Another was the rack, which slowly stretched the body until joints were pulled apart. The water torture, or toca, involved forcing water into the mouth and throat with a cloth to simulate the sensation of drowning, a technique that leaves no marks but produces sheer primal terror. Each method was chosen for its ability to inflict maximum pain while adhering to the technical, legalistic prohibition against spilling blood. The entire process was a grim theater designed to produce the desired outcome, a confession that would justify the punishment, close the case, and reinforce the absolute power of the institution that had engineered it. The techniques approved for extracting confessions were as horrifying in their specificity as they were in their application. Among the most prevalent was the strappado, a device of devastating simplicity. The accused would have their hands bound tightly behind their back. A rope was then looped around their wrists and thrown over a ceiling beam, allowing the inquisitors' assistants to hoist the victim violently into the air, suspending them by their arms, which were already wrenched behind them. The true agony, however, came with the addition of the jalon, or the drop. The prisoner would be raised high and then suddenly let go, plummeting downward until the rope snapped taut, jerking them to a stop and almost invariably dislocating both shoulders in a wave of blinding pain. This process could be repeated, each drop compounding the injury and the torment. Another centerpiece of the inquisitors' arsenal was the rack. Far from a simple table, this was an engineered instrument of prolonged suffering. The victim was laid upon a wooden frame, their wrists and ankles fastened to rollers at either end. With a slow, deliberate turn of a lever or crank, the rollers would rotate, stretching the body taut. With each click of the mechanism, ligaments and tendons would strain, joints would begin to separate, and the relentless pressure would build in the chest, making breathing increasingly difficult. The terror of the rack lay in its gradual, inexorable nature. The pain intensified predictably, and the prisoner was left to anticipate the next turn of the wheel, knowing their body was being systematically pulled apart. Perhaps the most psychologically terrifying method was the water torture, known as the toca, or later referred to as waterboarding. The prisoner was forced onto their back and secured to a sloping board, their head lower than their feet. A coarse cloth was placed over their mouth and nostrils, and the inquisitor would begin to pour jugs of water onto the fabric. The cloth would catch the water, forcing the individual to inhale it, creating the overwhelming and primal sensation of drowning. The body would convulse, desperate for air, while the mind was engulfed in the sheer panic of suffocation. This method was particularly favored because it left no physical marks, adhering to the Church's technical prohibition against drawing blood, yet it inflicted profound psychological trauma that could break even the most resilient spirit. These brutal practices were not acts of random cruelty, but were conducted under a strict and chillingly legalistic framework. The entire process was governed by ecclesiastical law, most notably shaped by Pope Innocent IV's bull ad extirpanda issued in 1252. This document officially authorized the use of torture by the Inquisition, but it did so with a series of cold, bureaucratic constraints that created a grotesque parody of justice. Torture could not cause permanent mutilation or death, a rule that led to the development of bloodless techniques like the strappado and water torture. A confession obtained under duress was considered invalid unless the accused willingly reaffirmed it at least a full day later, outside of the torture chamber. This rule was the cornerstone of the inquisitors' justification. They were not forcing a confession, they were merely using pain to help the sinner uncover a truth they were already hiding, a truth they would then freely admit. It was a system designed to produce not just a guilty verdict, but the appearance of a righteous and voluntary confession, laundering the brutality through a facade of holy procedure and saving the soul they were breaking. But securing a confession was only part of the process. The Inquisition's power truly solidified in the public eye through a terrifying ritual designed to be unforgettable. After the private dread of the dungeon and the confession extracted in shadow, the accused were brought into the blinding light of day for the auto de fe, the act of faith. This was not an execution, though executions were often its climax. It was a massive public spectacle, a carefully orchestrated theater of power meant to educate, terrify, and unify the entire community under the watchful eye of the church and state. The entire city would often come to a standstill for these events, which were treated as public holidays. Stages were erected in the main plaza, draped in black cloth and adorned with the flags of the Inquisition and the royal crest. The most prominent citizens, including the king and queen themselves in Spain, would occupy seats of honor, transforming the punishment of heretics into a form of macabre entertainment and a powerful display of sovereign authority. The ceremony could last for hours, even an entire day, and began with a solemn religious procession. Inquisitors, clergy, and officials would march through the streets, followed by the condemned prisoners themselves. These individuals were a horrifying sight, forced to wear the San Benito, a distinctive yellow sackcloth tunic. For those who had confessed and been reconciled to the church, the San Benito might be adorned with crosses. But for those deemed unrepentant or guilty of the most serious crimes, the tunic would be painted with flames and devils, a terrifying public announcement that they were destined for the fire. Some also wore pointed caps called corozas, making them instantly recognizable and utterly humiliated as they were paraded before their former friends and neighbors. This public shaming was a crucial part of the punishment, designed to strip the individual of their dignity and serve as a permanent warning to anyone watching. From the grand stage, the sentences would then be read aloud in full detail to the captivated and often fervent crowd. The punishments formed a precise hierarchy of pain and penance, each designed to fit the crime and the level of cooperation shown by the accused. Those who had confessed early and shown remorse might receive relatively light sentences. They might be forced to wear the humiliating San Benito for a period of time, undertake a pilgrimage, or be scourged through the streets while being whipped. Others faced years of rowing in the king's galleys, a sentence of brutal, exhausting slave labor that was often a delayed death sentence. For those who had confessed under torture but then reaffirmed their confession, the typical punishment was imprisonment. But this was not a standard jail term. Inmates in inquisitorial prisons were often kept in gruesome conditions, sometimes in perpetual darkness and chains, with their property confiscated to pay for their own upkeep, leaving their families destitute. The most severe fate was reserved for the few who refused to confess even under extreme torture, or those who, having confessed, later retracted their admission, a crime known as relapsing. These individuals were deemed unrepentant heretics and were relaxed to the secular authorities. This was a critical legal fiction. The church, which forbade itself from shedding blood, would hand the condemned over to the state with a recommendation for mercy that everyone knew would be ignored. The state would then carry out the execution, almost always by burning at the stake. For the Inquisition, this public burning was the ultimate symbolic act. It purified the community by fire, just as heresy polluted it. The execution was typically held outside the city walls in a place called the Quemadero, the burning ground. Those who expressed last-minute repentance might receive the small mercy of being garroted, strangled to death before their bodies were consigned to the flames. The truly defiant would be burned alive. The ashes of the condemned were then scattered, ensuring no physical remnant remained to become an object of veneration. This grand, gruesome spectacle was the final, indelible lesson for the crowd. Conformity meant life, and defiance meant a terrifying, total erasure. While the Inquisition was founded to combat specific Christian heresies, its scope rapidly widened, revealing that its true purpose was far broader than theological correction. It became a tool for enforcing a rigid social and racial order. The initial targets, like the Cathars and the Waldensians, were indeed seen as threats to church doctrine. The Waldensians, for example, were followers of Peter Waldo, a 12th century merchant who advocated for poverty and the right to preach without church authority. Their belief in translating the Bible into common languages and their criticism of clerical wealth made them enemies of the establishment. But as the Inquisition gained power, the definition of a target expanded to include anyone perceived as different, undesirable, or a threat to the emerging concept of a pure, homogeneous Christian state. This shift is starkly illustrated by the fate of Jewish and Muslim communities in Spain. For centuries, these groups had often lived in relative, though precarious, coexistence with Christians in a system known as convivencia. But as the Reconquista neared its end, the mood turned violently intolerant. The year 1492 is famous for Columbus's voyage, but it also marks the year Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra Decree, giving Spain's Jewish population a devastating ultimatum: convert to Christianity or be expelled from the kingdom entirely. Tens of thousands chose exile, abandoning their homes and livelihoods. Those who remained and converted, known as conversos or new Christians, found themselves in an impossible position. They were now officially Christian, but they were never truly accepted. They were perpetually suspected of Judaizing, the secret practice of Jewish rituals, a crime of thought and identity that the Inquisition was perfectly designed to investigate. The pursuit of these conversos exposes a critical and dark evolution in the Inquisition's logic, the move from policing belief to policing blood. Inquisitors began to develop the concept of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. This was a racist doctrine completely separate from religion, which held that Jewish ancestry itself was a taint that could never be cleansed by baptism. A person could be a devout, sincere Christian their entire life, but if they had a single Jewish ancestor generations back, they could be accused of having an inherent inclination toward heresy. Genealogies were scrutinized, and families lived in terror of a long-forgotten relative being discovered, a secret that could destroy them generations later. The Inquisition had effectively created a self-perpetuating system of persecution, as the very act of investigating a family created a stained record that could be used against their descendants indefinitely. A parallel tragedy unfolded for Spain's Muslim population. After the fall of Granada, Muslims were initially granted rights to their religion and customs, but these promises were quickly broken. Forced conversions created a new class of suspected heretics, the Moriscos, Muslim converts to Christianity. Like the conversos, they were watched with intense suspicion for any sign of reverting to their former faith, avoiding pork, wearing traditional clothing, or bathing on a Friday. The Inquisition's pursuit of them culminated in their eventual mass expulsion from Spain in the early 17th century, a brutal act of ethnic and religious cleansing that tore entire communities from their homeland. This expansion of targets beyond doctrinal heretics to entire ethnic and religious groups shows the Inquisition's core engine was not just faith, but a deep-seated fear of the other, and a ruthless drive to eliminate any diversity that challenged a narrow vision of a unified society. While the earlier Papal Inquisition was a formidable tool of the Church, the Spanish Inquisition represented something new and, in many ways, more terrifying. A perfect fusion of religious fervor and state power, operating with a degree of autonomy that made it uniquely efficient and brutal. Established by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella with papal approval in 1478, this was not merely a branch of the Roman Inquisition. It was a distinctly Spanish institution answerable directly to the crown. This royal control was its defining feature. The the Pope's authority over it was largely nominal. In practice, the Spanish sovereigns appointed the inquisitors general and directed its actions to serve national interests. This created a system where the machinery of faith was harnessed to the engine of the state, granting it immense resources and a political mandate that went far beyond purely religious concerns. This nationalistic drive was fueled by a deep and pervasive anxiety about identity in the newly unified Spain. After centuries of coexistence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews during the Reconquista, the victorious monarchy was obsessed with creating a completely homogeneous Catholic nation. The primary targets of this obsession were the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, and later the Moriscos, Muslims who had done the same. Unlike earlier inquisitions that focused on doctrinal purity, the Spanish tribunal became consumed with a suspicion that conversion was never sincere, that these new Christians were secretly practicing their old faiths in the privacy of their homes. This fear of hidden enemies within, of a fifth column undermining the spiritual health of the nation, provided the justification for its most infamous and destructive innovation, the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. This concept was a sinister perversion of religious teaching into outright racism. It argued that heresy was not a matter of choice or belief, but an innate, hereditary stain passed down through Jewish or Muslim ancestry. A person's faith became irrelevant, their bloodline was all that mattered. A devout Christian whose great-grandparent was Jewish could be considered more suspect and more inherently inclined to heresy than an old Christian with no such ancestry who rarely went to church. To prove their eligibility for positions in government, the church, or even certain guilds, individuals had to provide extensive genealogies, tracing their family back generations to demonstrate this purity of blood. This created a society obsessed with lineage and suspicion, where a forgotten ancestor could resurface to destroy a family's reputation and livelihood generations later. The bureaucracy of the Spanish Inquisition became a relentless engine for enforcing this racial ideology. Its tribunals were not temporary operations but permanent courts spread across the country, staffed by professional inquisitors and supported by a vast network of officials, lawyers, and notaries. They kept meticulous, terrifyingly detailed records of every case, every confession, and every family lineage they investigated. This immense archive wasn't just for current cases, it became a living database of suspicion, ensuring that the sin of one generation could be visited upon their children and grandchildren. The efficiency and reach of this administrative machine had no parallel in other inquisitions, allowing it to maintain a constant, low hum of fear throughout Spanish society for centuries. This institutional power reached its peak under the figure of Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain. A Dominican friar and personal confessor to Queen Isabella, Torquemada was the living embodiment of the alliance between throne and altar. His own fervent belief in the limpieza de sangre doctrine and his personal dedication to eradicating any perceived Jewish influence drove the Inquisition to unprecedented levels of severity. He centralized its operations, standardizing its brutal procedures and presiding over the most spectacular and deadly auto de fe ceremonies. While the exact numbers are debated by historians, his tenure is synonymous with a dramatic increase in trials and executions, cementing the Spanish Inquisition's reputation for a unique and systematic cruelty that served both God and the crown in equal measure. While the Spanish Inquisition solidified royal power at home, its Portuguese counterpart would prove that this system of control was not confined by borders, becoming a terrifyingly effective tool for exporting Europe's religious conflicts across the globe. The Portuguese Inquisition was formally established in 1536 by King John III, following a similar model to Spain's, but its motivations were deeply intertwined with Portugal's own burgeoning empire. The kingdom was a major naval power, its ships establishing trade routes and colonies from the coast of Brazil to the spice-rich ports of India. This global reach meant that the fear of internal heresy was compounded by an anxiety about maintaining religious purity across vast, diverse, and distant territories. The Inquisition became the mechanism for imposing a rigid, uniform Catholic identity on both its citizens at home and its subjects abroad, ensuring that the Crown's authority, both spiritual and temporal, remained unchallenged no matter how far from Lisbon. The primary focus of the Portuguese tribunal, much like Spain's, was the persecution of new Christians, Jews who had been forced to convert, often under horrific circumstances. In 1497, just 5 years after Spain's expulsion edict, King Manuel of Portugal had given his own Jewish population the same brutal choice: convert or be expelled. However, fearing a mass exodus of valuable merchants and skilled professionals would cripple his economy, the king soon resorted to forced mass baptisms, creating a large population of Cristãos Novos who were Christian in name only. Their descendants lived under a cloud of permanent suspicion, and when the Inquisition was finally established, it eagerly targeted this community, accusing them of the secret practice of Judaism or Judaizing. What truly set the Portuguese Inquisition apart was its relentless and far-reaching colonial arm. The tribunal's power did not stop at the shoreline. It bordered the very ships that were building the Portuguese Empire. In Brazil, the Inquisition's presence was felt through periodic visitations. Inquisitors would arrive from Lisbon with great fanfare, setting up temporary tribunals in major cities like Salvador da Bahia and Rio de Janeiro. They would announce an edict of faith, calling upon the population to denounce themselves and their neighbors for any behavior deemed heretical. In the socially fluid and racially mixed environment of the colony, these visits sparked waves of paranoia. Settlers, many of whom were themselves new Christians seeking a new life away from the watchful eye of Lisbon, now found the same apparatus of fear replicated in the New World. Accusations could stem from anything: a colonist avoiding pork, a slave reporting their master's private prayers, or a business rival settling an old score. Those accused were often shackled and shipped across the Atlantic to face trial and almost certain punishment in the inquisitorial prisons of Lisbon, a terrifying journey from which few returned. Yet the most extreme example of the Inquisition's global ambition was its establishment in Goa, India. Conquered by the Portuguese in 1510, Goa became the capital of their Estado da India, a vital hub for the spice trade. Here, the Inquisition was not just a visiting body, it was a permanent institution established in 1560 and operating for over 250 years. Its mission was uniquely complex: to police the faith not only of Portuguese settlers but also of the vast local population, which included Hindus, Muslims, and ancient communities of Syrian Christians whose practices differed from Rome's. The Goan Inquisition became infamous for its particularly violent zeal in rooting out what it saw as pagan contamination. It launched aggressive campaigns against Hindu rituals, destroying temples and sacred texts, and forced converts to adopt European customs, banning traditional dress and practices. The methods employed in Goa were as brutal as any in Europe. Thousands were tried, and public autos de fe were held regularly, with executions carried out by burning at the stake. The terror it instilled was so profound that it fundamentally altered the social and cultural landscape of the region, leaving a legacy of fear and religious tension that endured long after the Inquisition was finally abolished in 1821. This extension of the inquisitorial system into Asia demonstrated its ultimate purpose. It was a key instrument of colonial power, a means of enforcing cultural and religious assimilation on a global scale, proving that the fires of religious intolerance could burn just as fiercely under an Indian sun as they did in a European plaza. While the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions focused heavily on enforcing racial and social purity, the Roman Inquisition, formally established in 1542, had a different primary mission: to serve as the Vatican's own doctrinal police force, protecting the integrity of Catholic teaching from all forms of intellectual dissent. Its creation was a direct response to the Protestant Reformation, which had shattered the unity of Western Christendom. Pope Paul III saw the need for a centralized, powerful body based in Rome to combat heresy with greater efficiency and authority than the older, more dispersed medieval inquisitions could muster. This new institution was governed by the Congregation of the Holy Office, a committee of cardinals whose decree held immense power throughout the Catholic world. Their purview was vast, covering everything from blasphemy and superstition to the censorship of books, and most significantly, any scientific or philosophical idea that seemed to contradict a literal interpretation of Scripture. This obsession with controlling intellectual life led to one of the most consequential conflicts in the history of science and religion, the trial of Galileo Galilei. Galileo was not a heretic in the traditional sense. He was a devout Catholic and a brilliant astronomer whose crime was championing the Copernican model of the universe, which stated that the Earth revolved around the Sun. This heliocentric theory directly challenged the geocentric model that had been incorporated into church doctrine, which placed a stationary Earth at the center of God's creation. Using his newly improved telescope, Galileo gathered compelling evidence for Copernicanism, from the phases of Venus to the moons of Jupiter. He passionately argued that his discoveries revealed the true language of God's creation, written in mathematics. To the theologians of the Roman Inquisition, however, this was not a scientific debate. It was a direct challenge to biblical authority. If the Earth was not the immovable center of the universe, then certain passages of Scripture, which spoke of the sun stopping in the sky, for example, could not be interpreted literally. This threatened the Church's role as the sole interpreter of divine truth. The Inquisition's response was methodical and devastating. In 1616, they first declared the Copernican theory foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical because it contradicted Scripture. Galileo was ordered to abandon this view. For years he complied, but in 1632 he published his landmark Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, which presented the arguments for both geocentrism and heliocentrism in a way that made the Church's preferred model seem foolish. This was seen as a profound act of defiance. Summoned to Rome in 1633, the elderly and ailing scientist faced a lengthy interrogation. The Inquisition's tactics were less about physical torture and more about psychological and intellectual pressure, forcing him to recount his life's work under the threat of being declared a heretic himself, a fate that could lead to imprisonment or worse. Broken and fearing for his life, Galileo publicly abjured his belief that the Earth moves around the sun. Legend has him muttering, "And yet it moves under his breath," a powerful symbol of the irrepressible nature of truth in the face of institutional oppression. Galileo's trial was the most famous, but it was far from an isolated incident. The Roman Inquisition maintained the infamous Index of Forbidden Books, a list of publications Catholics were forbidden to read, own, or distribute. This list was a powerful tool for stifling intellectual progress, containing works by some of Europe's greatest thinkers, including Erasmus, Machiavelli, and later Descartes and Hume. The mere existence of the index created a climate of fear among scholars, printers, and booksellers who risked severe punishment for trafficking in banned ideas. This systematic censorship aimed to create an intellectual quarantine, preventing Catholics from being exposed to any philosophy or science that deviated from approved church teaching. The goal was to control not just what people did, but what they could even think about, ensuring that the challenging, transformative ideas of the Renaissance and scientific revolution would be slow to penetrate the Catholic world. The legacy of this intellectual suppression is complex and long-lasting. While the Roman Inquisition's power waned over the centuries, its confrontation with Galileo came to symbolize the dangerous friction between rigid dogma and scientific inquiry. It created a perceived rift between faith and reason that would influence Western thought for generations. The Church's eventual, belated acknowledgement of its error in the Galileo case centuries later underscores a painful truth. The Inquisition's attempt to control knowledge ultimately exposed the vulnerability of any institution that tries to stand against the tide of evidence and reason. It was a stark lesson that ideas, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered, and that the pursuit of truth, whether spiritual or scientific, cannot be permanently bound by the dictates of any authority, no matter how powerful. Yet within this vast machinery of fear, one group found themselves uniquely and disproportionately in the crosshairs of suspicion: women. While men were certainly accused of various heresies, the charge of witchcraft became a terrifyingly effective vector for persecuting women, particularly those who lived on the margins of society. This was not a coincidence, but the result of deeply ingrained misogynistic beliefs that had festered within European culture for centuries. The Church Fathers had long propagated the idea that women were the morally weaker sex, more susceptible to temptation and sin, a notion tracing back to the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden. This theological framework painted women as inherently more carnal, more easily deceived by the devil, and thus more likely to enter into a pact with him. An independent-minded woman, a skilled midwife, or a solitary healer who used herbal knowledge could easily be reimagined not as a valuable community member, but as a dangerous vessel for demonic power. The stereotypes that fueled these accusations were chillingly specific and formed a ready-made profile for inquisitors. The classic image of the witch was an old, poor, and unmarried woman, often a widow who lived alone. Her isolation made her vulnerable, as she lacked a family or a husband to defend her against slander. If she owned property, an accusation could be a convenient way for a neighbor to seize it. If she was known for healing with herbs or had knowledge of childbirth, any unfortunate outcome could be maliciously reinterpreted as maleficium, harmful magic. A failed crop, a stillborn child, or a sudden illness in the village could all be laid at her door. The very traits that might make a woman knowledgeable or self-sufficient were systematically twisted into evidence of a diabolical compact. Perhaps no single event illustrates the scale of this gendered panic more than the Basque witch trials that erupted in the early 17th century. The frenzy began in the Pyrenees region of Spain and France, centered around the town of Zugarramurdi. It started, as so many did, with a few young girls who claimed to have been bewitched. Under intense pressure and leading questions from local priests and then inquisitors, their stories grew increasingly elaborate. They spoke of nocturnal gatherings known as éclats, where they flew on animals to remote fields, renounced their faith, and paid homage to the devil in the form of a billy goat. The accusations began to snowball, fed by a climate of hysteria, until thousands of people, the vast majority of them women, were implicated across the region. The Spanish Inquisition, surprisingly, eventually stepped in to curb the worst excesses of the trials. An inquisitor named Alonso de Salazar Frias, appointed to investigate, took a remarkably skeptical approach. He traveled the region, demanded physical evidence for the fantastic claims, and found nothing but rumors and coerced confessions. In a groundbreaking report, he argued that the entire affair was based on fantasy and fear, not fact. His reasoned intervention helped bring the massive witch hunt to an end, a rare instance of the Inquisition itself acting as a moderating force against local superstition. However, this was an exception that proved a brutal rule. Across Europe, from Germany to Scotland, similar panics led to the execution of tens of thousands of women, a tragic testament to how easily ancient prejudices could be weaponized by a system built on suspicion and secret testimony. The witch trials stand as one of the darkest chapters in the Inquisition's long history, revealing how its power could be directed not just against religious dissent, but against society's most vulnerable members. The long shadow cast by the Inquisition stretched far beyond the walls of its dungeons and the smoke of its autos de fe, seeping into the very fabric of daily life and permanently altering the cultural and psychological landscape of Europe. For centuries, its presence fostered a climate of profound fear and self-censorship that became second nature to millions. People learned to police their own thoughts, their words, and even their casual social gatherings, forever wary that a misplaced joke about a saint, a moment of doubt expressed to a friend, or a simple preference in food could be misconstrued and reported. This atmosphere of suspicion didn't just enforce religious conformity, it eroded the fundamental bonds of trust that hold a community together. Neighbors became potential informants, and family conversations were held in hushed tones, forever fearful that children might innocently repeat something heretical outside the home. The Inquisition didn't just punish dissent, it successfully preempted it by making everyone an accomplice in their own surveillance, creating a society gripped by a low-grade but constant anxiety. This culture of fear had a direct and stifling effect on intellectual and artistic expression. The institution's power to censor was absolute, enforced through the infamous Index of Forbidden Books. This list was not a mere suggestion, it was a mandate that dictated what ideas were permissible, banning the works of Europe's most brilliant minds. Scholars, writers, and scientists operated under a pervasive threat, knowing that exploring certain lines of inquiry or engaging with new philosophies could bring them to the attention of the tribunals. The result was a form of intellectual quarantine, particularly within Catholic nations. While the Protestant North experienced the ferment of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the South often lagged, its thinkers forced to navigate a treacherous path between curiosity and orthodoxy. Art, too, was channeled into safe, propagandistic themes. Paintings from the Spanish Golden Age, while technically magnificent, frequently focused on martyrdom, mystical visions, and the triumph of the Church, reinforcing official dogma rather than challenging the viewer with new perspectives. Creativity was sublimated into the service of the very institution that suppressed its free exploration. Perhaps one of the most enduring and tragic legacies was the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. This concept, pioneered by the Spanish Inquisition, introduced a poisonous form of racial hierarchy into a continent previously preoccupied with religion and class. It created a permanent underclass of conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, and their descendants who were forever suspect no matter how devout they appeared. Their faith was irrelevant, their bloodline was considered inherently tainted. To secure employment, gain entry into universities, or join prestigious orders, individuals had to provide extensive genealogies proving their old Christian heritage, a process that gave rise to a whole industry of fraudulent documentation and paranoid record-keeping. This institutionalized racism fractured communities and created a lasting social stigma that would echo for generations, long after the Inquisition itself had faded, planting early seeds for the ethnic prejudices that would later mar modern history. The psychological trauma inflicted on individuals and collective groups is immeasurable but undeniable. For those who endured imprisonment, torture, or the auto-da-fe, the scars were lifelong. But the trauma also extended to entire communities who lived for generations under this specter of fear. A deep-seated distrust of authority, particularly religious authority, became ingrained in the cultural memory of places like Spain, Portugal, and their former colonies. This suspicion often manifested as a public performance of strict piety, masking a more private, complex relationship with faith, a phenomenon some scholars call cultural crypto-belief, where outward conformity served as a protective shell for inner doubt or inherited tradition. Furthermore, the experience of being perpetual outsiders, of having one's identity scrutinized and criminalized, forced many Jewish and Muslim converso communities to develop a culture of secrecy and dual identities, skills necessary for survival that would be passed down through families as a dark inheritance. Ultimately, the greatest impact of the Inquisition may be the uncomfortable mirror it holds up to human nature itself. It stands as a stark case study in how easily systems of justice can be perverted into instruments of oppression, how quickly fear can be weaponized to make citizens complicit in their own subjugation, and how the desire for purity, whether religious, racial, or ideological, can lead to unimaginable cruelty. Its legacy is a cautionary tale about the dangers of granting any institution the absolute power to define truth, to police thought, and to demand conformity at the expense of compassion, reason, and the rich, messy diversity of human experience. The silence it imposed and the shadows it cast are a reminder that the price of uniformity is often the very soul of a society. What makes the Inquisition so uniquely knowable, and yet in many ways still so shrouded in mystery, is its own obsessive bureaucracy. For an institution dedicated to secrecy, it was paradoxically one of the most fastidious record-keeping organizations in history. Every step of its dark process was meticulously documented by a small army of notaries and scribes who sat in the corners of interrogation rooms, their quills scratching away as confessions were extracted and sentences were pronounced. These men were tasked with creating a perfect, legally defensible, at least by their standards, paper trail for every case. The result of this compulsive documentation is a vast and chilling archive, a mountains of parchment that details the terror in dry, administrative prose, from the first whispered accusation to the final verdict read aloud at the auto de fe. These records were not mere notes, they were formal transcripts written in a precise and formulaic Latin. The protocol was strict. The notary would record the date, the location, the names of the inquisitors present, and then transcribe the entire interrogation in a question-and-answer format. The questions posed by the inquisitor were written down, and the responses of the accused were recorded, though we can never be certain how faithfully those terrified words were captured. The documents also included lists of witnesses, though often without their names, to protect them, the evidence presented, and the final sentence. This created an illusion of scrupulous fairness and judicial rigor, a cold ledger of condemnation that masks the fear, the pain, and the psychological torment that filled the rooms where these words were spoken. For the Inquisition, this paperwork was essential. It was the mechanism that transformed arbitrary brutality into sanctioned procedure, laundering violence through the language of law and order. For centuries, these archives remained locked away, the secret history of the Inquisition's operations known only to a handful of Vatican scholars and officials. The very opacity of these records became a part of the Inquisition's enduring mythos, fueling speculation about what dark truths might be hidden within. A significant turning point came in 1998 when Pope John Paul II, as part of a broader effort to confront the Church's past, ordered the opening of the archives of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the modern successor to the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition. This unprecedented move granted qualified historians access to millions of pages of documents covering trials from the 16th century onward. The wealth of information contained within these archives is simply staggering for researchers. They provide an almost microscopic view of social history, revealing not just the broad strokes of theological conflict, but the intimate details of everyday life centuries ago. The transcripts are filled with accidental revelations: what people ate, how they dressed, what they argued about with their neighbors, the jokes they told, and the private doubts they harbored. We learn about the lives of people who would otherwise be completely lost to history, their voices preserved only because they were caught in the Inquisition's net. The archives have been particularly invaluable in correcting the historical record, allowing scholars to move beyond myth and quantify the scope of the Inquisition's activities with greater accuracy, often debunking exaggerated claims about the number of executions while simultaneously revealing the profound and widespread psychological impact of its pervasive surveillance. Yet, for all the insights they offer, these archives also perpetuate a profound and intentional opacity. The records are written from the exclusive perspective of the persecutor. We hear the accused's words only as they were filtered through the inquisitor's questions and the notary's pen. The raw fear, the defiant silences, the agonized screams during torture, these are all absent, sanitized into a sterile legal narrative designed to justify the outcome. The system's most chilling efficiency may lie in this very act of documentation. It created a permanent, official reality where the Inquisition was always rational, always justified, and always in control. The archives, therefore, are not a window into absolute truth but a one-sided mirror, offering invaluable glimpses into a terrifying world while forever obscuring the full human horror experienced by those who entered its chambers. While the Inquisition's machinery consumed countless anonymous lives, its history is also written in the stories of specific individuals whose names have endured, their ordeals illuminating the particular flavors of fear and injustice the system could produce. One of the most poignant, though technically outside the formal papal system, was the trial of Joan of Arc. Her story, unfolding in 1431, captures the essence of inquisitorial procedure, demonstrating how a spiritual court could be weaponized for starkly political ends. A young peasant girl who claimed divine visions guiding her to lead the French army against English invaders, Joan was an unprecedented threat to the established order. Her captors, the English and their Burgundian allies, needed to discredit her miraculous victories and legitimize her execution. They achieved this by handing her over to an ecclesiastical court led by Pierre Corchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, who proceeded with all the trapping of an inquisitorial trial. Joan's interrogation was a masterclass in theological entrapment. For weeks, she was questioned by dozens of learned clerics who probed the nature of her visions, her insistence on wearing male clothing, and her obedience to the church. Their goal was to get her to admit that her voices came from demons, not God, thereby proving her a heretic. What makes her trial transcript so compelling is the clear intelligence and steadfast faith of a 19-year-old girl facing a panel of the most powerful men in Europe. She parried their complex theological traps with simple, shrewd answers, often frustrating her interrogators. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a question designed to damn her, as no one could be certain of such a thing, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was a response of such nuanced faith that the stunned court had to move on. Unable to break her spirit through debate, they ultimately resorted to threat of fire, forcing her to sign an abjuration she likely didn't understand. When she later recounted, they had their proof of relapse and she was burned at the stake in Rouen, a martyr made by the very process that sought to destroy her. In stark contrast to Joan's simple piety stood the brilliant, enigmatic figure of Giordano Bruno, a man whose case demonstrates the Inquisition's fear of ideas too vast and revolutionary to control. A Dominican friar, philosopher, and cosmologist, Bruno's mind ranged across the universe, literally. He championed the Copernican model that the Earth revolved around the Sun, but he went much further, proposing a shocking infinity of worlds, each with its own sun and perhaps its own life. This wasn't just a scientific challenge, it was a theological earthquake. An infinite universe without center diminished the unique significance of Earth, humanity, and the Christian story of creation and redemption. For a church insisting on a single, created, and geocentric universe, Bruno's cosmic vision was sheer heresy. His trial by the Roman Inquisition was a protracted battle of wills that dragged on for 8 years. Unlike Galileo, who would face a similar system decades later, Bruno refused to recant his philosophical beliefs. He was a man of immense intellectual courage, convinced of the truth of his ideas and unwilling to subject them to the authority of any tribunal. The Inquisition, accustomed to eventual submission, found in him an immovable object. With no confession to validate their process, they ultimately declared him an impenitent and pertinacious heretic. His sentence was brutal in its finality. He was to be burned alive without the shedding of blood, a technical hypocrisy. Upon hearing the verdict, Bruno is said to have told his judges, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." In 1600, he was executed in Rome's Campo de' Fiori, his mouth gagged to prevent him from speaking his final truths to the crowd, a chilling symbol of the institution's ultimate purpose, to silence what it could not understand. These two cases, though centuries apart, bookend the Inquisition's terrifying range. Joan of Arc was persecuted for a personal, divine connection that threatened political hierarchies, her trial a perversion of faith to achieve a worldly goal. Giordano Bruno was eliminated for the boundless nature of his intellect, his ideas deemed too dangerous to be allowed to exist. One was a young woman guided by voices, the other a philosopher guided by reason, yet both were destroyed by the same machinery of absolute certainty. Their stories remind us that the true target of such systems is never just heresy, but any form of human expression, whether mystical or intellectual, that challenges the limits of control. Beyond the grand ideals of religious purity and political control, the Inquisition was powered by a far more mundane and cynical engine, a sophisticated, self-sustaining economic system that thrived on the very persecution it claimed was its only purpose. At its heart was a simple, brutal equation. Heresy was a crime, and the property of a convicted heretic was forfeit. This principle of confiscation, known as fisco, transformed the tribunal from a purely doctrinal body into a financially motivated enterprise, creating a powerful and often corrupting incentive to find guilt. The entire apparatus, from the Grand Inquisitor's salary to the maintenance of the prisons and the pay for guards and notaries, was funded directly by the seized assets of those it condemned. This meant the system had a direct monetary stake in its own continued existence and success, blurring the line between holy duty and profitable enterprise in a way that would taint its every action. The process of seizure was immediate and devastating. The moment a person was accused, their property could be inventoried and sequestered, frozen until the outcome of their trial. This was a punishment in itself, plunging an entire family into instant poverty and uncertainty, regardless of the eventual verdict. If the accused was found guilty, everything was confiscated: their home, land, savings, business inventory, and even their personal belongings like furniture and clothing. The proceeds were then divided according to a strict formula. A portion went to the royal treasury, cementing the crown's financial interest in the process. Another portion funded the operations of the Inquisition itself, and a share often went to the informants and officials involved in the case, directly rewarding those who brought accusations and secured convictions. This created a perilous environment where a person's wealth could make them a target, as their confiscated assets represented a lucrative prize for the tribunal and its collaborators. This financial incentive inevitably warped justice, leading to stark examples where wealth, not genuine suspicion of heresy, seemed to be the primary motivator. The persecution of conversos in Spain is a particularly dark illustration. Many Jewish families who converted had become successful merchants, bankers, and artisans. Their economic success often bred resentment among their old Christian neighbors, and the Inquisition provided a perfect, legally sanctioned vehicle to strip them of their wealth under the guise of religious fervor. A rival could eliminate a business competitor, a debtor could cancel a debt, or an envious neighbor could covet a fine house, all by lodging a secret accusation of Judaizing. The tribunal, perpetually in need of funds, had little reason to scrutinize such motives too closely when a conviction promised such a rich payoff. The case of Maria Gonzalez, a wealthy conversa merchant in 16th century Seville, is tragically illustrative. Known for her successful textile business, she was accused by a business rival of secretly lighting Sabbath candles. Despite a lack of concrete evidence, her property was seized immediately. The detailed inventory taken by the Inquisition's officials listed everything from her bolts of expensive silk to her silver cutlery, a testament to the value she represented. Her subsequent trial and conviction, based largely on coerced testimony, ensured that her entire estate was absorbed into the Inquisition's coffers, funding its operations for months and rewarding her accuser with a portion of the take. Her story was repeated thousands of times over, revealing a system where spiritual salvation was often secondary to financial solvency, and where the fight against heresy became inextricably linked with the pursuit of profit. Yet, even within this suffocating atmosphere of control, the human spirit refused to be entirely extinguished. Resistance to the Inquisition was a dangerous and delicate art, practiced not on battlefields but in the hidden corners of daily life, a testament to incredible courage and cunning in the face of overwhelming power. For many, the most immediate and vital form of defiance was simply to vanish. Fleeing the reach of the tribunals required meticulous planning and a willingness to abandon everything: home, property, and community. Those with means might bribe ship captains to secure passage to more tolerant regions like the Ottoman Empire or cities in the Netherlands, where religious diversity was grudgingly accepted. For others, escape meant a life constantly on the move within their own country, assuming new identities in distant towns where no one knew their lineage or past. This internal exile was a precarious existence, forever shadowed by the fear of being recognized by a familiar or having one's accent betray a forbidden origin. For those who could not flee, survival demanded a different kind of bravery: the performance of a false life. This was the realm of the crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims, entire communities who outwardly practiced Catholicism with exaggerated piety while secretly preserving their true faith behind locked doors. In Spain and Portugal, these individuals developed an intricate culture of deception to protect themselves. They might attend Mass regularly and enthusiastically, even volunteering for prominent roles in religious processions to bolster their cover. At home, however, they would observe their actual rituals in utter silence. Jewish families might light Sabbath candles inside covered pots to conceal the flame, or hold abbreviated Passover seders in cellars after nightfall. Muslim families might perform ritual ablutions with water collected from rainfall rather than a well to avoid suspicion. This double life was psychologically torturous, a constant high-wire act where a single mistake, a forgotten detail, or the betrayal of a child who innocently repeated something they saw could doom an entire family. This clandestine resistance was often supported by covert networks that operated right under the Inquisition's nose. In major cities, secret communities developed sophisticated ways to identify one another through subtle signals: a specific turn of phrase, a particular way of breaking bread, or a discreet gesture. They shared information about safe houses which officials were particularly zealous and which might be open to bribery. There are documented cases of warnings being passed through these shadowy channels, giving a targeted individual a precious few hours to flee before the alguacils arrived at their door. These networks functioned as a kind of silent underground railroad, a fragile web of trust in a world deliberately engineered to foster paranoia and betrayal. Their very existence was a stunning act of defiance, proving that even the most totalitarian systems cannot completely eradicate human solidarity. Perhaps the most subtle and enduring form of opposition was intellectual dissent. Some of the most brilliant minds of the era learned to cloak their challenging ideas in layers of irony, allegory, and coded language to evade the censors. Writers and philosophers became masters of double meaning, crafting texts that could be read one way by the authorities and another by those in the know. A political treatise might use ancient Rome as a stand-in for contemporary Spain, or a poem about Greek gods could subtly critique the abuse of power within the church. This intellectual guerrilla warfare ensured that dangerous ideas continued to circulate, if only among a trusted few. Even within the church itself, there were courageous voices of restraint. As we saw with the witch hunts, inquisitors like Alonso de Salazar Frias in Spain used reason and bureaucratic insistence on evidence to dismantle the wildest accusations, arguing that the devil's greatest trick was not witchcraft, but convincing the Inquisition to believe in fantasies that turned neighbor against neighbor. Their internal opposition, though often limited, occasionally managed to temper the institution's worst excesses and save countless lives. But no institution, no matter how powerful or deeply entrenched, is immune to the shifting tides of history. The monolithic edifice of the Inquisition, which had cast its long shadow for over 6 centuries, began to show its first serious cracks not from a violent revolution, but from a revolution of ideas. The Enlightenment of the 18th century ushered in a new age of reason, skepticism, and an emphasis on individual rights that stood in direct opposition to the Inquisition's core principles of enforced conformity and dogmatic authority. Philosophers and writers like Voltaire in France and Montesquieu openly mocked the tribunal's methods and its very premise, championing instead the ideals of religious tolerance and the separation of church and state. Their works, though often banned by the Inquisition itself, circulated among the educated elites, slowly eroding the intellectual foundations that had supported the institution for so long. This new worldview argued that a person's conscience was a matter between themselves and their God, not a subject for state-sponsored terror, fundamentally challenging the moral justification for the Inquisition's existence. The rise of secular nation-states and the sweeping political upheavals of the early 19th century delivered the more direct, fatal blows. Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in the first decade of the 1800s was a cataclysmic event for the Inquisition. As French troops marched into Spain and Portugal, they brought with them the revolutionary legal codes of post-revolutionary France, which explicitly outlawed the tribunal. In 1808, Napoleon's officials formally abolished the Spanish Inquisition, seeing it as a bastion of the old, superstitious order they sought to dismantle. Though this abolition was temporary, the Inquisition was reinstated after Napoleon's defeat and the restoration of King Ferdinand VII in 1814. It had been profoundly weakened. The genie of secular authority and liberal thought could not be put back in the bottle. The experience had demonstrated that a foreign power could simply decree an end to the Inquisition, emboldening its domestic opponents. The final act of this long drama was driven by relentless pressure from liberal factions within Spain itself, for whom the Inquisition had become the ultimate symbol of everything they wished to reform, a corrupt alliance between a reactionary monarchy and an authoritarian church. Throughout the 1820s, Spain was racked by civil war between liberal constitutionalists and absolutist supporters of the crown. Each swing of the political pendulum affected the tribunal's fate. It was briefly abolished again by liberal governments, only to be restored by Ferdinand. This back and forth revealed the Inquisition was now a political pawn, its power entirely dependent on which faction held the throne. Its final end came not with a dramatic battle, but with a quiet legislative decree. In July of 1834, the Regent Maria Cristina, acting for the young Queen Isabella II, signed a royal statute that formally and permanently abolished the Spanish Inquisition. This time, the abolition stuck. The property of the Inquisition was transferred to the state, and its vast archives were sealed away, a relic of a fading world. The formal end of the institution, however, did not mean the immediate disappearance of its influence or its methods. The Roman Inquisition, though greatly diminished, continued to exist in a reformed state, eventually becoming the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith within the Vatican, focused on internal theological discipline rather than prosecuting heretics. More hauntingly, the spirit of the Inquisition, the use of secrecy, anonymous denunciation, and the power to police thought proved stubbornly resilient. In the 20th century, scholars have drawn compelling parallels between the inquisitorial manuals and the methods of modern totalitarian states, from the secret police of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to the McCarthyite witch hunts in the United States. The same techniques of isolating a victim, demanding confession, and using that confession to validate the system's own authority reappear, demonstrating a chilling continuity in the mechanics of oppression. The long, slow death of the Inquisition serves as a powerful reminder that while institutions can be abolished, the human capacity for fear and intolerance is a far more enduring opponent, one that requires constant vigilance to overcome. For generations, our understanding of the Inquisition was painted in the broadest and darkest of strokes, shaped more by myth and Protestant propaganda than by documented fact. The popular image, heavily influenced by works like Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, was one of an all-consuming monster, a relentless killing machine that executed millions in a perpetual frenzy of fanatical violence. This caricature, however, has been systematically dismantled by decades of meticulous historical research, much of it made possible only by the recent, unprecedented opening of long-sealed archives. The true picture that emerges is not one of a less horrific institution, but of a far more complex and insidiously efficient one, whose true power lay not in how many it killed, but in how completely it controlled the living. The most startling revision concerns the scale of executions. For centuries, figures ranging from hundreds of thousands to several million were casually cited. However, painstaking analysis of trial records from the Spanish Inquisition's own fastidious archives has provided a more accurate, if no less grim, tally. Modern historians like Henry Kamen now estimate the number of people executed by the Spanish tribunal over its entire 350-year history to be around 3,000 to 5,000. The Roman Inquisition's numbers were lower still. This is not to minimize the tragedy of each life lost, but to correct a profound misconception. The Inquisition's primary goal was not extermination, but ideological conformity and social control. It achieved this far more effectively through the threat of punishment and the spectacle of humiliation than through mass slaughter. The auto de fe was designed to terrorize the multitude, not to eliminate them. Understanding this lower death toll actually deepens our appreciation of its menace. It was a system that ruled through psychological terror so potent it required relatively few fires to keep an entire population in check. Where the myths of exaggerated violence are debunked, the archives have simultaneously confirmed the breathtaking scope and bureaucratic coldness of the Inquisition's daily operations. The real numbers that stagger historians are not the executions, but the trials themselves. The Spanish Inquisition is believed to have processed over 150,000 cases. This means that for every person sentenced to death, dozens more endured the horrors of arrest, sequestration of property, imprisonment, interrogation, and the lifelong stigma of a conviction. The recently opened Vatican archives pertaining to the Roman Inquisition have revealed a similar pattern of extensive judicial activity focused on censorship, monitoring intellectual life, and trying cases of superstition and Protestant heresy. These documents confirm that the institution's most pervasive weapon was not the stake but the process itself. The slow, grinding, and utterly terrifying machinery of accusation, trial, and sentence that could ruin lives and families without ever imposing a death sentence. This treasure trove of primary source material has also allowed scholars to move beyond the institution itself and reconstruct the intimate social history of the people it targeted. The trial transcripts are accidental time capsules preserving the voices of everyday people, their arguments with neighbors, their domestic habits, their jokes, and their private doubts in astonishing detail. We learn not just what they were accused of, but how they lived. This has enabled a much richer understanding of the accused as complex individuals, often caught in a web of local rivalries, personal vendettas, and economic jealousy that had little to do with genuine religious devotion. The archives reveal the Inquisition as a mirror reflecting the darkest aspects of the societies it operated in, where its power was so often hijacked to settle petty scores and enforce social conformity under the thin guise of religious purity. Perhaps the most significant modern revelation is the nuanced understanding of resistance and adaptation. The records are filled with evidence of ordinary people fighting back with incredible ingenuity. They employed clever lawyers who found loopholes in inquisitorial procedure. They delayed proceedings with appeals, and they mastered the art of performance, publicly adhering to every Catholic ritual while privately maintaining their own beliefs. The archives of the Portuguese Inquisition, for example, are filled with cases of new Christians developing intricate secret signals and creating hidden networks to warn each other of arriving inquisitors. This evidence of widespread crypto belief and clandestine organization shows that the Inquisition, for all its power, never achieved the total ideological control it sought. The human spirit, as documented in its own obsessive records, proved to be resilient, adaptable, and fiercely protective of its identity, even under the most oppressive of systems. While the historical reality was one of bureaucratic terror and psychological control, the Inquisition we most commonly encounter today is a creature of myth and melodrama, a version shaped far more by the conventions of Hollywood and literature than by the dusty parchment of archival records. This pop culture version is often a caricature, a garish collage of red robes, sinister torture devices, and comically fanatical priests, an image that has become so ingrained in our collective imagination that it can be difficult to separate the fact from the fiction. Perhaps no single piece of media has done more to cement this particular vision than Monty Python's classic comedy sketch, The Spanish Inquisition. Bursting onto screens with its catchphrase, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," and its trio of bumbling, inept cardinals, the genius of the sketch lies in its inversion of power. It takes an institution synonymous with absolute terror and renders it utterly ridiculous, defined by its pathetic attempts to employ outrageous torture devices like the comfy chair and the soft cushions. This hilarious deconstruction is less an attempt at historical accuracy and more a satire of rigid, unthinking authority in all its forms, but its enduring popularity has inevitably colored how generations view the actual institution, simplifying its complex history into a punchline about unexpected fanaticism. Beyond comedy, the Inquisition provides a ready-made backdrop for Gothic horror and dark fantasy, offering a world where absolute good and absolute evil are locked in a dramatic struggle. Writers and filmmakers frequently mine this period for its intense atmosphere of fear and superstition, often amplifying the violence and occult elements to heighten the drama. The seminal fantasy novel, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, stands as a notable exception, offering a far more nuanced and historically grounded portrayal. Set in a 14th century Italian monastery, the story uses a murder mystery as a lens to explore the intense theological debates and power struggles within the church, with the arrival of a learned inquisitor, played chillingly by Sean Connery in the film adaptation, raising the stakes. Eco, a renowned medievalist, populated his story with authentic period detail and captured the intellectual paranoia of the era, where a debate over whether Christ owned his clothes could be a matter of life and death. Yet, even here, the narrative leans into the genre's requirements for suspense and a shadowy, labyrinthine setting, blending its historical fidelity with the conventions of a thriller. This tendency to amplify the horror finds its extreme expression in video games and darker fantasy films, where the Inquisition is frequently reimagined as a corps of fanatical witch hunters or demon slayers. In these narratives, the historical institution's methods are not just accepted but are often presented as a necessary, if grim, defense against very real supernatural forces. This portrayal creates a fascinating moral ambiguity. The Inquisitor becomes a brutal anti-hero whose horrific actions are justified because the monsters are literally real. This trope allows audiences to safely explore the allure of fundamentalism and absolute certainty from a distance, engaging with the themes of power and persecution within a fantastical context where the stakes are clear and the enemies are definitively evil. It simplifies the complex, often economic motivations of the real Inquisition into a pure, melodramatic battle of light versus darkness, providing a satisfying narrative clarity that history itself often lacks. The cumulative effect of these varied portrayals is a significant gap between academic understanding and public perception. For many, their entire knowledge of the subject is filtered through these dramatic lenses, which prioritize emotion and narrative thrust over historical nuance. The real Inquisition's power resided in its slow, grinding legal process, its destruction of families through property confiscation, and its creation of a culture of silent fear. The pop culture version, by contrast, almost exclusively focuses on the moment of extreme physical torture or execution, the dramatic crescendo rather than the years of quiet dread that preceded it. This doesn't make these cultural artifacts worthless. On the contrary, they serve as powerful indicators of what the Inquisition has come to symbolize in the modern mind. It is our go-to metaphor for any form of dogmatic intolerance, thought policing, or unjust persecution, a shorthand we use to critique modern-day witch hunts in politics or social media. These stories, whether played for laughs or for scares, keep the memory of the institution alive in our culture, ensuring that its name remains a potent warning against the dangers of granting any authority the absolute power to dictate truth and punish doubt, even if the specific historical details have been streamlined into a more dramatically potent legend. Reflecting on the Inquisition's long and shadowed legacy, we uncover not merely a historical curiosity but a profound and urgent cautionary tale, one that speaks directly to the enduring tensions between authority and liberty, faith and force, security and freedom. At its core, the Inquisition demonstrates how easily systems of justice can be twisted into instruments of oppression when they operate without transparency, accountability, or genuine compassion. The same mechanisms that once labeled a neighbor a heretic for avoiding pork or reading the wrong book find their echo in modern manifestations of prejudice, where people are still judged not by their actions but by their ancestry, their beliefs, or their identity. This historical pattern urges us to remain vigilant against the seductive allure of absolute certainty, the kind that places ideology above humanity and purity above mercy. One of the most critical lessons lies in the vital importance of due process and the rule of law. The Inquisition's legalistic facade, its meticulous records, its formal procedures, masked a system fundamentally rigged against the accused. Individuals were guilty until proven innocent, denied the right to confront their accusers, and subjected to a process designed not to discover truth but to extract confession. This perversion of justice finds disturbing parallels in modern examples of judicial overreach, where expediency or political pressure leads to the erosion of legal protections. From the use of torture in some contemporary counter-terrorism efforts to the wrongful convictions rooted in coerced testimony or systemic bias, the same dangerous logic persists, that the end of securing a conviction justifies any means, even if it undermines the very principles of fairness the system is meant to uphold. Beyond the courtroom, the Inquisition's legacy warns us about the corrosive social impact of state-sponsored surveillance and the weaponization of suspicion. By encouraging anonymous denunciations and rewarding neighbors for spying on one another, the tribunals shattered community trust and normalized betrayal. This model of social control feels uncomfortably familiar in our digital age, where privacy is increasingly fragile, and where online platforms can sometimes become arenas for public shaming and vigilante justice. The same human tendencies that once fueled whispers in a medieval town square now drive cancel culture and digital witch hunts, where accusations can spread globally in seconds, often with little evidence and less recourse for the accused. The Inquisition reminds us that a society that incentivizes suspicion ultimately breeds isolation and fear, damaging the social fabric in ways that can take generations to repair. Perhaps the most poignant ethical takeaway is the danger of conflating ideological purity with moral righteousness. The inquisitors genuinely believed they were saving souls and protecting society, yet this conviction blinded them to their own capacity for cruelty. This tragic paradox, where good intentions are used to justify horrific actions, recurs throughout history, from religious wars to political purges. It challenges us to cultivate humility in our own convictions, to question whether our efforts to create a better world might inadvertently mirror the oppression we condemn. The story of the Inquisition implores us to champion not rigidity but empathy, not conformity but compassion, recognizing that true justice must always leave room for doubt, for dialogue, and for the dignity of the human spirit, even when it dares to be different. For centuries, the image of the Inquisition has been dominated by a handful of powerful and often wildly inaccurate myths. When many people close their eyes and picture it, they see an unstoppable engine of death, a monolithic entity that burned heretics by the millions in an unending frenzy of fanatical violence. This sensationalized version of events, however, says more about our own attraction to dark legend than it does about the complex historical reality. The truth is far more nuanced and in some ways even more troubling. By examining the actual numbers and the institution's varied application across Europe, we can move beyond the caricature to understand the true nature of its power and why its more subtle methods were ultimately so much more effective. Let's tackle the most persistent myth first, the scale of the executions. Exaggerated figures, often claiming hundreds of thousands or even millions of victims, have been repeated for generations, largely originating from anti-Spanish and anti-Catholic propaganda spread by Protestant rivals during the 16th and 17th centuries. These numbers were designed to shock and horrify, painting the Catholic Church as a uniquely murderous institution. Modern historical research, made possible by the painstaking analysis of the Inquisition's own detailed records, has dramatically revised these estimates downward. For the Spanish Inquisition, which operated for over 3 centuries, the most reliable scholarly estimates from historians like Henry Kamen point to approximately 3,000 to 5,000 executions. The Roman Inquisition's numbers were significantly lower. This correction is not an attempt to minimize the tragedy of each life lost or to whitewash the institution's actions. Rather, it forces us to confront a more unsettling truth. If the Inquisition wasn't massacring people on an industrial scale, how did it maintain such a fearsome grip on society for so long? The answer is that its real power lay not in how many it killed, but in how completely it controlled the living. The primary goal was not extermination but enforcement of ideological conformity, social order, and political loyalty. The relatively low death toll reveals an institution that ruled through the pervasive threat of punishment rather than through its constant application. The auto de fe was a terrifying public spectacle precisely because it was a rare event. Its power to intimidate relied on its drama, not its frequency. Another widespread misconception is that the Inquisition was a single, monolithic beast, applying the exact same level of brutality everywhere it operated. In reality, its character and intensity varied dramatically across different regions and time periods. The medieval Inquisition focused on specific heresies like Catharism, while the Spanish Inquisition was deeply concerned with racial purity and political unification. The Roman Inquisition, born from the Counter-Reformation, was particularly obsessed with intellectual censorship and combating Protestant ideas. This meant that your experience with the tribunal depended entirely on where and when you lived. A person accused of witchcraft in a remote Basque village during a peak panic might face horrific odds, while a scholar debating astronomy in Rome might undergo a lengthy, albeit still terrifying, intellectual interrogation. Some inquisitors were known for their relative leniency or skepticism, like Alonso de Salazar Frias, who helped end the Basque witch trials by demanding actual evidence. Others, like Torquemada, became synonymous with relentless severity. The methods, too, evolved. early periods might have seen more extralegal violence, while the later, fully bureaucratized Inquisition preferred prolonged imprisonment and psychological pressure over hasty executions. Recognizing these variations is crucial to understanding that the Inquisition was not a static monster but an adaptable tool, its harshness tuned to the specific fears and ambitions of the society it served. Ultimately, debunking these myths does not make the Inquisition any less horrifying. It simply shifts our horror from a focus on sensationalized body counts to a more profound appreciation of its insidious efficiency. The real story is not one of chaotic bloodshed, but of cold, calculated, and systematic social control. It was the threat of losing your property, your reputation, and your freedom, of facing a terrifying and rigged legal process that kept entire populations in line. This was a system that could ruin your life without ever lighting a single fire. By moving beyond the myths, we see the Inquisition for what it truly was, a sobering lesson in how authority can wield fear as its most potent weapon, proving that the most effective prisons are often the ones built not with stones, but with rules, bureaucracy, and the silent, complicit fear of the human heart. This pervasive atmosphere of fear did something far more damaging than just enforce obedience. It rewired the very social DNA of communities, creating a legacy of psychological trauma that would ripple through generations. The most immediate and obvious impact was the climate of profound distrust that settled over towns and villages like a permanent fog. When anyone, a neighbor, a business rival, even a family member, could be a secret informant, the fundamental bonds of community began to fray and then snap. People became afraid to speak freely in their own homes, fearing a child might innocently repeat a careless comment or a servant might overhear a private doubt and report it for a reward. This forced a performative existence where every public action was meticulously calibrated to project an image of flawless orthodoxy. You didn't just have to be a good Catholic, you had to be seen as one constantly. This erosion of trust created a society of isolated individuals, perpetually performing for an invisible audience of potential accusers, a psychological burden that is difficult to overstate. For persecuted groups like the Conversos, this pressure was exponentially worse, leading to a devastating crisis of identity that fractured families and lineages. Forced to convert under threat of expulsion or death, and then perpetually suspected of being false converts, they were trapped in an impossible double bind. They were not accepted by the old Christian community they had joined, yet they were often severed from the Jewish community they had been forced to leave. This created a profound internal schism, a feeling of not belonging anywhere. To survive, many families developed a torturous double life. Publicly, they were devout Catholics attending Mass with exaggerated fervor. Privately, behind locked doors and shuttered windows, they might cling to fragments of their ancestral traditions. They might light Sabbath candles inside a covered pot to hide the flame or hold a silent, abbreviated Passover Seder. This constant vigilance and the fear of discovery created a deep-seated anxiety that became ingrained in the family psyche, an inherited trait passed down as cautionary tales and whispered family secrets. The trauma was not merely emotional, it was also written into biology through a phenomenon known as epigenetic inheritance. While the science is still emerging, studies suggest that extreme and prolonged stress can alter how genes are expressed, potentially passing a predisposition to anxiety and hypervigilance to subsequent generations. The children and grandchildren of those who lived under the Inquisition's shadow may not have faced the dungeons themselves, but they could have inherited a neurological state primed for fear, a heightened sensitivity to threat, and a deep, often unconscious distrust of authority. This biological echo means the legacy of the Inquisition is not just a story in a history book. For some, it may be a part of their very physiological makeup, a silent, cellular memory of a time when a knock on the door could end everything. This history of forced conversion and secret identity has left a complex and often painful mark on cultural memory that persists to this day. In places like Spain and Portugal and across Latin America, many people are now delving into genealogical records, often discovering with surprise or shock their own converso ancestry. This revelation can be a powerful, identity-shifting experience, forcing a re-evaluation of family stories and cultural practices that once seemed mundane. Why did a grandmother always light candles on Friday night? Why were certain foods avoided or certain prayers whispered? These fragments suddenly take on new meaning, becoming clues to a hidden past that was deliberately obscured for survival. This process of rediscovery is not just about the past, it's about reconciling a fragmented identity in the present, connecting to a heritage that was brutally suppressed but never entirely erased. The psychological patterns born in the shadow of the tribunals, distrust of outsiders, a preference for secrecy, and the rigorous enforcement of social conformity unfortunately found new life in later periods of history. Scholars have drawn compelling parallels between the methods of the Inquisition and those of modern totalitarian regimes. The use of secret police, anonymous denunciations, and show trials to purge society of undesirable elements in 20th century fascist and communist states feels hauntingly familiar. The same mechanics of fear, the same weaponization of suspicion, and the same demand for ideological purity repeat themselves, demonstrating that the human capacity for this kind of social control is not confined to the medieval world. The Inquisition, in a sense, wrote the early playbook for how to break a society's spirit and enforce conformity through terror, a playbook that would be consulted and refined by dictators for centuries to come. As we draw the curtains back on this dark chapter, the true contours of the Inquisition's horror come into focus, revealing an institution whose power was built not on faith, but on a foundation of fear, secrecy, and a chillingly efficient bureaucracy. The darkest secrets we've uncovered are not merely the brutal tools in the torture chamber, the dislocating agony of the strappado, the suffocating terror of the water torture, the psychological torment of isolation, but the cold, calculated system that made them possible. This was a legalized machinery of pain designed to produce not just confession, but the illusion of voluntary admission, laundering brutality through a facade of holy procedure. Beyond the physical suffering lay an even more insidious secret, the economic engine that drove the entire operation. The systematic confiscation of property from the accused created a vicious cycle where the Inquisition relied on its own persecutions for funding, blurring the line between holy duty and profitable enterprise. This financial incentive turned neighbor against neighbor, allowing envy, rivalry, and greed to be settled with a whispered accusation, transforming the fight against heresy into a sanctioned tool for theft and social climbing. Perhaps the most profound revelation is how the Inquisition's true power resided not in the fires of the auto da fe, but in the silent, pervasive fear it implanted within entire societies. It weaponized suspicion, eroding the very bonds of community and forcing people to police their own thoughts and words. It introduced the poisonous doctrine of purity of blood, perverting faith into a form of racism that judged individuals not by their beliefs, but by their ancestry, creating a lasting legacy of social stigma. This journey through the shadows of history is more than an exploration of the past. It is a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of justice. The Inquisition stands as an eternal cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what happens when authority is granted the absolute power to define truth, to police thought, and to demand conformity at the expense of compassion and reason. Its story warns us of the dangers of ideological purity, the seductive allure of absolute certainty, and the ease with which systems of justice can be twisted into instruments of oppression. Let this not be a tale we simply close the book on, but a lesson we carry forward. In a world where echoes of these patterns can still be heard in prejudice, in the weaponization of suspicion, in the demand for ideological conformity, the call for vigilance, empathy, and tolerance has never been more critical. History's darkest chapters are not meant to be forgotten, but to be remembered as a guide, urging us to build a world where diversity is celebrated, conscience is respected, and the human spirit is never again forced to hide in the shadows. If this journey into the past has resonated with you, I invite you to share your own reflections in the comments below. What parallels do you see in our world today? And if you're eager to uncover more mysteries history has tried to keep secret, consider subscribing for our next deep dive into the untold stories of our world.